Hi, it is my honor to introduce Transplants for Children, which is a nonprofit organization headquartered in the San Antonio area that assists and support recipient children and their families in dealing with the challenges of organ transplantation. The organization was founded in 1986 by the Sutton family, themselves a transplant family, to improve the lives of children needing organ transplants by providing financial, emotional, and educational support. Transplants for Children has a dedicated team of professionals who ensure that every child and their family receive the best care possible during the transplant process. Their programs include TFC Families Connect, which is a support program, STAR Scholarship, College Success, Pediatric to Adult Care Transition, PACT support, and Family Emergency and CoPay assistance. The organization is committed to positively impacting the lives of children and their families while they are going through this journey. We are honored to have them with us today on the topic of speaking with your peers about your transplant. Thank you so much for joining.
Hello, my name is Kirsten Barnes. I am a part of Transplants for Children, and I am a two-time kidney recipient. Our topic here that we're going over today is how to engage with peers about transplants. Like I said, I am a two-time kidney transplant recipient. I got my first kidney transplant back in 2011 when I was 15 years old, and I got my second one in 2021 when I was 25 years old. It's been quite of a journey. I started dialysis at 12 years old as a young kid, and so I had to grow up pretty fast, but I wouldn't change my life for anything. It's made me who I am today.
I'm Carmelita Baza. I'm a transplant recipient mom. And I have 5 kids. And Zachary is our transplant recipient. He is our youngest child, and he is now 15 years old.
Hi, I'm Zach. I had a small bowel pancreas and liver transplant. And yeah.
I'm Dr. Eliot Lopez. I'm an assistant clinical professor with UT Health San Antonio. I work with the University Hospital's pediatric transplant team and also the adult transplant team. I sit on the board for Transplants for Children, and I've been with the pediatric team for going on 3 years now.
My name is Iliana. I'm the clinical social worker at University Transplant, and I've been in that role for about 4 years. So let's begin. And so I'm going to ask questions, and whoever wants to answer can answer. Okay. So I guess the first question, and kind of the elephant in the room, is if somebody knows you have a transplant or if your peers are aware of it, is it rude not to ask?
As far as my experience, I don't think it's necessarily rude not to ask. You know, it's always that just judgment of, is it the right time? Is it the right place? Or even some people, you know, how should I ask? You know, and I never get offended when somebody asks me, you know, oh, you know, what, and especially because I have a fistula on my arm that I use for dialysis. And so with having a big bump on my arm, back in school, I would get a lot of stares and, you know, a lot of questions. I guess the thing that would offend me the most is the faces that people would make, like, oh my God, you know, what is that on your arm? You know, stuff like that. But when that was asked the right way, it never really bothered me. And I think it's more informational to ask rather than just assume. You know, yeah.
As the mom of a transplant recipient, and since Zachary received his recipient or his transplant when he was 6 months old, he was a little one and had a feeding tube, and so he was always wearing the feeding tube at that time. And it was interesting to me to see how different parents handled their kids asking, because young kids would have no problem. What is that? And some parents would hush them and don't say anything. And, you know, that kind of struck me as weird. But then there were the parents that, well, I don't know. why don't we go ask him?
Yeah.
You know, and that really impressed me. I thought that was good of the parent to, you know, to do that, as well as respecting us. It wasn't like, oh, we don't want to talk about it, you know?
Yeah.
So that was my experience when he was young
Yeah.
and had the feeding tube.
And you know, kind of the same thing as far as like, even with me being older, little kids are ruthless, man. You know, they will ask anything that comes to mind, you know, and so, yeah, like, and
Yeah.
even dealing with that, you know, and going back, I had to understand, you know, they don't know, they're young, they don't have, you know, the capacity to understand how to ask, you know, so I would have to understand, okay, stay calm, you know, they're not trying to be rude, they're just curious. And so that's when I take the opportunity to educate rather than, you know, to hold back.
Right, I think that's huge for a kid to be able to do that though, like
Yeah.
to have the understanding of like, this is foreign to them, let me not be offended, because I can imagine that it would be very easy to just kind of feel hurt and kind of shut down from that.
Yeah, exactly. And I got this when I was 12 years old. And so going through that, I was in middle school. And you know, kids my age, that's when I was really restricted and stuff like that. Going through dialysis, you know, and even I wore pull-ups until the age of 12 because at that age, my bladder wasn't developed all the way. And so also dealing with that, you know, I would try to hide that from the most that I could, you know. Thankfully, when I got my first transplant, that was the doctor's worry was, are you gonna have to continue to wear diapers again as you get older? You know, is your bladder gonna get stronger or whatnot? And thankfully, you know, my first transplant, my bladder had already grown strong, and so I didn't have to growing up. But just with that alone, and you know, having the kids wonder, oh, why do you have a pull-up in your bag? You know, and I would have to lie like, oh, it's for my niece, so I left it for my cousin, you know, or whatever. But being a big kid in 7th, 6th grade and having to, you know, do that, it was kind of rough, you know, looking the kids in the face and, you know, wondering, you know, what am I gonna say exactly?
In my experience working in clinic, working with kids of different ages, you know, it's been my observation that depending on the age, their experience has been different, like how they receive some of those looks, right? Like, so the younger ones get those a lot more than maybe like our 16, 17-year-olds. So like how other people see it is really driven a lot by like how old they are, how they've been socialized, kind of like what Carmelita was saying, like how the parents kind of reinforce that. I wonder if you have that experience too, since the two of you have different ages when you've like gone through the transplant experience.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've definitely noticed that as I got older, the looks and, you know, the questions kind of got more broad, but more appropriate, you know, rather than, you know, and I'll say it again, kids are ruthless, you know, like when I was in high school, even having this thing on my arm, you know, you would think, oh, teenagers, you know, they're going to be like, oh, you know, what is that? But, you know, and I've had a few times where I'd actually get offended because someone would come up to me and literally grab my arm and say, what is that? And I would have to get inappropriate, you know, because I was offended. But then later on, I would have to think, you know, and I know even then, you know, you should never touch anybody, you know, it's inappropriate, but it's kind of like, I would have to talk myself down from the anger that I had because I know no one else knew what it was. No one else knew exactly how to handle it, you know? And so, yeah, I have noticed that as I got older, it's gotten easier because people have, I guess, quote unquote, more respect for people, you know? And so it's definitely gotten easier as I've gotten older, but growing up as a kid, dealing with that was definitely an issue. I actually ended up having to change high schools due to depression when I was 16 years old because I was going through that. And also that's a big step in transplant with the medications that you're taking with the prednisone and, you know, CellCept and everything. It messes with your mind, you know, and so I did have to end up switching schools because of that. And like I said, as I got older, it just got easier. I've learned how to handle it better and rather than just, you know, getting angry. And like I said before, I take it definitely as a learning lesson. I'd rather teach rather than get mad, you know, so.
So did you find friend groups that was specific to y'all that would support you and kind of help protect you maybe from the stares and the looks from other people in your school?
Well, Zach was really young. And so in grade school, it was pretty much they, the adults that led the, okay, we're not gonna be rude, we're not gonna, kind of thing. But I don't know, so when kids would ask you, what is that thing? Would it get you angry or were you okay with explaining it?
Yeah, I would tell them. But they kept like. That's,
Were any of them ever rude or
I mean,
ugly about it?
yes.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, and the same thing, I mean, honestly. Even though, since I've been in the transplant world, because it's a whole other world from outside in the normal world, if that makes any sense, but. Being inside the loop with transplant as I was growing up, it was very hard for me to find someone outside of the organizations that I was in. I go to Camp John Mark, or I used to as a kid, and I'm actually going back as a counselor this summer. But Camp John Mark has a Camp Raynal for kidney kids. And so that was a group that I would be with for a whole week that I grew really close relationships with some of the people there. And the same thing with Transplants for Children. Transplants for Children, I was in the STARS program at 12 years old once I started dialysis and was looking for a transplant. And I have friends from that organization till this day. We've been friends for over 10, 15 years now, thanks to Transplants for Children. And, other than that, that was the hardest part for me, was to actually find someone out in the regular world, not that you would see every day, but I didn't really ever see anybody that, had a transplant. But then again, as I grew up and I got older, I started to understand, people look at me, and if I'm wearing a long sleeve, they can't tell I've had a transplant. They think I look normal, but until they see the scars, or I actually start speaking about it, they're not going to know about it, and so it's not like it would be the same for me as far as someone else. Yeah, I may know the signs of what to look for, like, oh, if they have a fistula, if they have a catheter or a feeding tube, I'll know the signs to look for, but not every transplant is like that, and so it would be the identifier of more in the transplant organizations that I would find people that I can relate to,
Yeah.
rather than just in the regular everyday world.
Kirsten, to your point, I'm thinking of a patient that I saw just this week. One of the issues that comes up is, depending on how ill a kid is, they might not be in school all that frequently, right? Like,
Yes.
you've got fatigue, you have things like dialysis that take them out of school, you've got doctor's appointments. So when they're not in school, it just kind of prevents them from making those relationships and those peer connections that other kids get to have.
Yeah.
It's not so different from when somebody's homeschooled, right? Like,
Yeah.
they only have so many friends.
Mhm.
So it makes it tough, not just in terms of finding those friends, but also learning how to make those friends.
Yes, exactly. And I actually had to be homeschooled for 6 months after my first transplant. And I was a freshman in the middle. I actually got it during spring break freshman year. That I got the call, right?
Oh my gosh.
Waste my spring break. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I got.
There are worse things you could do on spring break.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I got it during spring break freshman year, and for the remaining of the year onto the middle of first semester of 10th grade, my immune system was so down because it was my first transplant, prednisone, the cell set program, all that. I had to be homeschooled, and so I didn't have that connection to my friends anymore. I had the ones that I grew up with or, learned with in 9th grade. But other than that, I lost that connection. And even when I started to get sick in 6th grade, the middle of 6th grade to the end of 7th grade was pretty much a blur for me, because I was going through the transition of hemodialysis, and we tried peritoneal, it didn't work, but missing school, half of school 3 days a week, for me was hard. Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. I wouldn't get to school until noon, so I pretty much missed half the day. And with that, I wouldn't see half of the kids, and thankfully, the teachers worked with me, and I would go home and do my work at home for my morning classes. but it was tough, definitely dealing with that and having to do school also.
That's your point earlier about kids being brutal. They notice you're not there.
Exactly, yes.
So I guess I have a question for you, Dr. Lopez, you know, in talking about the difficulty that you shared and also you and Zachary. In working with the teams that we work with, what do you think builds resiliency, or what do you think kind of builds support and then just continuing the path of transplant?
I think a lot of it comes from their environment, right? Like, so they come home to family who are supportive or non-supportive, so that can impact things. You know, one of the strongest signs I see of how well a patient's gonna do in clinic is whether their parents are there with them, because they, you know, they're invested, they're engaged, they show up, they ask questions, they answer questions, they, you know, they really kind of engage not just with me, but with the medical team, they make sure their kid's doing okay. They step out when it feels like they think their kid might have something important to say, right? Like they're really just kind of responsive to what's going on with the patient. But I also think that a lot of that is learned experience. Like I think Kirsten kind of touched on something. The more you go through this, the tougher you build that shell around yourself, right? Like, because resilience doesn't come from things being easy. Resilience comes from things being difficult. So I think some of these hardships that they face kind of really strengthens them up.
With Zach, his experience was much different as far as his age when he received his transplant.
Yeah,
So he has no memory of what was happening before and, you know, and so he's kind of been in charge of, and really he didn't have, he had the feeding tube through grade school. But then he switched schools, and when he made the transition to the other school, he stopped with the feeding tube. He was able to, so it was like he was kind of reinventing
yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
And he could tell whoever he wanted, if he wanted to, about it. And so it wasn't very evident until, like in gym class, he'd have to change.
Yeah.
And he has a scar right across his abdomen. And so what did you tell the kids when they asked about your scar?
I mean, sometimes I would joke around, or sometimes I would tell the truth. I usually tell them that I got bitten by a shark. But then I would tell them that I would have surgery because I had a small bowel increase in the transplant. Yeah.
And they probably weren't sure what that was anyway.
Yeah.
You were the kid who survived a shark attack.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny you say that, because growing up with my fistula, when I first got it, it was so big. People would ask me what it was, and at the time, my favorite movie was Terminator. And so I would look at them like, it's a tumor, you know, it's a tumor. You know? But then, you know, eventually, yeah, like, you know, I would tell them what it was and, you know, things like that. But the same thing with gym class, you know, growing up and having to wear the pull-ups and the Pampers, you know, they would see that I would bleed to go change rather than changing with everyone else, you know, and so having to deal with that, you know, I definitely, yeah, that was there. You know.
So what advice would you all give to somebody who's going through this or who's potentially facing transplant? Yeah. What would you say?
I think that my number one thing would be is to, as I said before, take every experience as a teaching experience. Only because, you know, not everyone is going to know, you know, most people think, and I've noticed this as I started working with Transplants for Children, that most people think when you get a transplant that it's a cure. But they don't realize that after transplant, there's medications that you have to take. There's, you know, checkups that you have to get. There's labs that you have to get, you know, a continuous thing. Yes, you may look a lot healthier than what you look like, you know, and I can only speak for myself from when I was on dialysis, you know, but it's the keep up afterwards, you know, and even with that being said, both of my kidneys were deceased donors. And so with that being said, I've come to the realization in life that eventually, even though I just got my second transplant 2 years ago, coming up on June 3rd, I'm gonna need another one in my 30s, you know, or hopefully in my 40s if it lasts that long. But A deceased donor transplant typically only lasts anywhere from 12 to 15 years. And so I've had to come to terms with that.
Countdown.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so that would be my biggest advice is to definitely take every experience that you get as a teaching experience and teach as many people as you can, about the situation, because not many people know about it, and even though I'm in the transplant world, and to me, I know there's so many transplant kids out there and there's so many organizations out there for transplant hospitals. But compared to the quote unquote normal world, that's just a small bit of it, and so every experience that I get, with people asking questions and whatnot, I take that as a learning experience and teach them, oh, this is what it is. This is what you can do to help, or this is what we can do to help, so I definitely take it. That's my thing, is take every experience that you can as a teaching experience.
Mrs. Baza, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So mom of 5 kids,
Uh-huh.
how did you balance everything? I mean, I've worked with parents that have one child and that child is critically ill and their entire time has been in the hospital. How did you balance kind of maintaining?
Pretty
all of that?
much.
Yeah.
I mean, my husband was a great support and he did what he could, but he also knew, okay, we've got this other family, all the other kids, and we need to, they're very spread out. So some were already out of the house. Just in fairness, I'm not, I have 5
Still,
kids.
5 kids, 5 kids. Still,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the biggest lesson that I had to learn was to ask for help and delegate and not be afraid to say no. And I still struggle with that. We were talking about my schedule earlier, and I need to remind myself to do those things. Because number one, I mean, all I could do was be present. There wasn't anything I could do. I'm not a surgeon. I couldn't do the procedure. I couldn't, but all I could do was be there with and with Zach and for Zach, learn as much as I could when I was in the hospital, which I had excellent, the whole staff, nurses, doctors that were just great educators about this is what this medication is. And this is what it does, so I had it's so corny, but it does take a village. You can't do this on your own. And my other thing that I'd like to say would be definitely, I know your time is precious and you're with the transplant recipient and it's hard to get away, but for sure, look for organizations like Transplants for Children. Look for, if they're not presented to you, because there is so much help out there. And usually it was presented to me. That's how I found out about Transplants for Children. But yeah, just not having to be in control, which we're not in control.
Yeah.
But coming to that realization and especially where this was concerned, where Zachary's health was concerned and the whole situation, I had to, that was the biggest lesson, one of the biggest lessons for me as a parent.
So Zachary, you can pass the question along if you'd like, but what's one thing that you would like people to know about training? So somebody who has no idea what it is. What's one thing you can say?
I don't know.
One thing that I would want people to know about transplants I guess it's pretty much like I said before, because I feel, at least in my eyes, I feel like that's the biggest misconception about transplant is that it's not a cure. A lot of people really think that, once you have a transplant, you're good, and that's not the case at all. And even with sometimes, even getting that transplant and going through that process, it may not always, even though the tests say that it's a match, it may not always be a perfect match when they put it in. And so sometimes that kidney or that liver or, that bone marrow, or I don't know exactly how bone marrow works, but I know I've seen for sure kidneys and livers and even hearts, that after the transplant, within a week or two, they need another one because it either didn't act correctly, it didn't go. And, as you said, we try to, make a plan, oh, we're going to have their transplant on this day. And then afterwards, here's all the care. But in reality, we're not in charge, and I say it all the time, God has a plan for everyone, and so with that being said, that is the biggest thing that I would want people to know is that transplant is not a cure and it's definitely not promised. And even with being on a transplant list alone, a transplant can take anywhere from 3 years to 10 years, on that list, trying to build your points up and to get that transplant. But, what do they think is going on within that 3 to 10 years that you're waiting? You're getting sicker or you're having to do dialysis longer, your body's failing because your organ's failing, and like I said, even after transplant, it's the upkeep that you have to do. They say that the ages between 17 and 23 are the most crucial ages for transplant, and that's when they typically fail because not only are the kids growing up, and I'm a part of that statistic, unfortunately, my transplant failed when I was 22, and I take that as a learning lesson now with my second one, and I know what not to do. And I'll say that, only because, you're finding yourself, you're growing, you're trying to be normal, you're trying to fit in, and, and going with that, I guess the peers, and finding that group of friends that understands, even though they may know about your transplant, doesn't necessarily mean that they understand, and so with that being said, like for example, with myself, I had friends that knew I had a transplant, but yet would offer me to go drinking, or would offer me to go do other stuff. And it's like, I would be enabled because, oh, that's my friend, I want to go hang out with them. I want to go do this. I want to be normal, and I would go out and do these things. And that's why my kidney failed the first time, because I wasn't doing what I was supposed to, and like I said, they may know, but that doesn't mean they necessarily understand. And so that would be the one thing is it's not a cure. You have to take care of yourself. You have to take care of your body, your transplant, your medications, just so it can last as long as you want it to, as long as it can.
I think from the outside looking in, the thing, and as somebody who works with kids and adults looking for transplant or recovering from transplant or dealing with transplant, living with transplant, is that that's not all you guys are, right? Like there's more to your lives. And I think that can be a challenge, especially when you're an adolescent, right? Like it's taking up so much time and so much energy. And the other kids are just kind of seeing you as, the sick kid in class, the kid who was absent a lot, right? But like, Kirsten, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I honestly wanted to be a police officer growing up.
Right.
Every kid's dream.
What about you, Zach? What do you want to be when you?
I don't know.
I'm still trying to figure it
out.
Okay. See, things that have nothing to do with transplant, things that have nothing to do with your health, like, right? Like they're just things about people that, I think we focus on one part of it. And I think especially when we're talking about engaging with peers, that's the part that stands out, right? The thing that makes us different and not necessarily the thing that makes us the same, which is how you form these relationships with the organizations you mentioned, right? Like that kind of cancel each other out because everybody here has a transplant or is seeking transplant or something like that. Now we can focus on the other stuff. Right?
Exactly.
We don't need to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's where adults seeking transplant and kids who are going through it, like that's where that common ground can come in.
Yeah. Absolutely, and like I said, I definitely had to grow up faster than what I had anticipated on, because with my kidneys failing completely at 12 and having to start missing school and start dialysis and everything, I had to grow up faster than I initiated, only because I had to understand what was going on with my body. I had to understand what I needed to do to take care of myself. I had to also understand the terminology. Terminology in the hospital is not easy all the time, and so they'd come in and be like, okay, you're gonna be on the peritoneal machine for 3 hours and then it's gonna dilute your fluid and I'm like, can you say that not in Spanish? It's like, I'm trying to understand, and like Carmelita, going through that, I definitely had a wonderful team with me that would explain everything and take their time so that I understood, and even with my mom, it was only me and my mom growing up. She was a single mom. I was her one and only. That's my name in her phone, one and only. But growing up, even seeing the transition with her and understanding now what she had to go through, that was also the same thing as far as her understanding, okay, he has a transplant, but he's also a kid, and so even with that, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but I would still get my butt whooped growing up, because even though I had a transplant, or I was going through things, in her eyes, I was still normal, she saw me as a child, and yeah, we had all these complications and everything, but at the same time, and I thank her for that, she wasn't gonna have pity on me, and there was time and a place, yeah, she would have to kind of tone it down or whatnot. But in the long run, I was raised as a normal kid, for that simple fact. She didn't want me to have pity on myself when it came to everybody else.
Yeah.
She wanted me to have as much of a normal life as I could, and so I thank her for actually the way that she raised me, only because I wouldn't be who I am today without her.
Yeah, there was, in my experience as a parent of an infant, basically, who received a transplant, there were other parents of little kids that, they literally decided not to allow their child to do pretty much anything outside of the house.
Yeah.
And in speaking to the surgeon that did Zach's transplant, she's like, we don't do this so that you can keep them in a bubble. We do this so that they can live life and live it as fully as possible. And so, yes, initially when he got out of transplant, I carried my Clorox wipes with me and I'm wiping because he was still a little kid that would put everything in his mouth.
Yeah.
So we'd go to a restaurant, I'd wipe down the table myself, all those things. And then as time went, it got less and less of that kind of extreme type of behavior on my part. But when we could see that, okay, he's getting stronger and he hasn't been in the hospital and he's doing really well, then I could, kind of step back a little with that. So yeah, it was quite an experience. I learned how to place a feeding tube and, all of in fact, he had that feeding tube till just about a year ago, and he learned how to place his own feeding tube. So it's something to be proud of. It's not something, like you said, that everybody's gonna understand, but that's really a quite a unique thing,
And I think y'all's story is unique in the fact that, you're saying you had to explain your experience to your friends and your peers. I'm wondering, how was it like when you had to tell him when he was old enough to understand that he was transplanted, right? That had to be a conversation, right? Or was
it
always...
was just kind of a slowly going into it, because he was getting all these medications and, yes, I'd have to put in the tube and, and I think as I was doing the things is kind of how it evolved into telling him, I'm doing this because this and this and this. It wasn't just like one day I'm like, okay, we're going to have the talk, you
Right.
know?
Right.
In this case, it's the transplant talk.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of, it was, you know, why is mom giving me all these medicines and and then it started now that he's older and almost, you know, well, almost 18, 3 years. You know, it's okay, what is this medication for? This is why you're taking this medication. What is this called? You know, trying to get him to understand the importance.
Yeah.
You know, so you know, so that he can look at your situation and hopefully not follow
Yeah.
that exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And, you know, but I mean, we've been 15 years with the small bowel, pancreas and liver that he received as an infant. So we're doing really well. And he's been very healthy.
Well, I have another question for you actually. Okay. So like in your experience with these patients, what kind of vocabulary do you give them speaking with their peers, or if they're struggling with kind of making friends or building connections? How do you support them?
So as I've gotten older, I'm like aging out of some of the things that teens would do. So disclosure, Iliana and I have a support group, and one of the things that she's learning in group is how many kids play games, like online games.
Yeah.
And I think there's a shared language that kids have that adults don't. And I think anything that we can do to foster that is important, because you know that's one of those things that I was mentioning before. It kind of highlights something that they have in common rather than that's different.
And
That's not transplant. And you know, with us living in 2023 and a lot of online gaming is online, and
Yeah.
you know, you can do it from home, you can do it if you're out sick, you can do it without, you know, you can do it remotely. And I think we have a participant in our group who had a suggestion for like starting a Discord server where like all our transplant patients could kind of connect and talk outside of things.
Yeah.
But even outside of that, right? Like if you don't want it to be about transplant, like, are you guys playing Fortnite tonight, right? Like things like that help to connect them a little bit more. Because I think those are the kinds of things that bring people together rather than focusing on, you know, your health. You know, when you think of some of your closest friends who don't have a transplant or don't have a medical illness that's similar to you, you think about what brought you together. Like I'm thinking about my childhood best friend. It's like, he was my best friend because he sat next to me and he had a Mario shirt on. Like, that's all it took. He had a Mario thing. I liked Mario. Like we started talking because of that. And you know, anything that you can do to find that common ground is what's going to kind of bring those people together. Because those are the things that keep people together.
Any other thoughts?
So just taking.